Hey guys, and welcome back to Just Ask Jason, our weekly devotional here at Berean. This week I want to talk about David and Bathsheba, and if you haven't heard that story before, it goes something like this. The king of Israel, his name is David, is hanging out at his palace in Jerusalem, and he goes up to the roof one night. He's just kind of going on a stroll, and he looks out over the city, and he sees a beautiful woman who's bathing on the rooftop. And he's king of Israel, and he lives in a culture where having lots of wives is acceptable. But there's an issue. Because not only does he lust after this woman, he thinks he recognizes her. And he's pretty sure she's married. So he inquires, he makes sure, and it turns out, yeah, this is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who's one of David's sisters. And he reaches out to her anyways. He sends some men to collect her, brings her to the palace, and he has sex with her, and she becomes pregnant. So now he realizes, oh man, there's no way I'm keeping this quiet. I've got to do something to address this. So he tries to cover it up. He tries to convince Uriah that this might be his child. When his cover-up fails, he actually has Uriah murdered in order to cover up what he's done. We hear this story and we think, man, that is problematic. That is really disturbing. That's a big issue, man. David really messed up, and he did. But there's a very problematic theory that comes up that I've heard preached in sermons, I've read in books and blog posts. I've even been lectured and taught it in a lecture format in a theological institute. And it's a theory that I think is really problematic and doesn't have a whole lot of evidence to support it. And the theory goes like this, that Bathsheba knew that David was going to be on the roof that night, and she intentionally seduced him in order to move up in society. So basically the idea is that Bathsheba either knew he'd be there that specific night or knew at some point he would. And so she went up and she bathed on the roof, and she made sure that the king saw her naked because she knew she was beautiful, and she knew that he would lust after her, and she knew that he would get rid of her husband somehow and that she could become his wife. And the theory is problematic for a few reasons. Let's start off with why I don't think that you should buy it. Very simply put, there's not any evidence for it. First of all, proponents of this argument will argue simply that Jerusalem was very tightly packed, that she would have been very close to the palace, would have known potentially that the king was on the roof. And even on top of all of that it wasn't customary to bathe on the roof. And commentators that support this are actually very intelligent people. One of them was Kenneth Bailey, super, super smart dude, wrote some amazing commentaries I'd highly recommend. I just think they're off base with this one. You see, Bathsheba had no way of knowing when David was going to be on the roof and when he wouldn't. That's the first issue. The story reads as though it was a spur-of-the-moment decision, that maybe he was having trouble sleeping or something and decided to go for a walk. So first of all, she wouldn't necessarily know when he was going to be on the roof. Second of all, even if she did know that he was going to be on the roof, there's another issue, a bigger issue, that the Bible never states that she did anything wrong. And you hear that and you go, Jason, just because the Bible doesn't say it doesn't mean it isn't true, which has some merit to it. But the problem is this: the Bible almost always says when someone committed a sin, unless it is very, very obvious. But in this story, the only person who's ever condemned is David. The only person who's ever condemned is David. 2 Samuel 11 and 12 is where you'll find this story. And in 2 Samuel 12, then Nathan the prophet comes to David, the king of Israel, and tells him a fable, a parable, a story about a rich man who steals a sheep from a poor man. And when David gets angry and says, whoever did this, whoever that rich man is, he deserves to be punished, Nathan says, you are that rich man because you are king of Israel. You already had 7 wives. You already have a massive household. You have all the riches in the world. You have every possible thing you could ever want. And yet you stole another man's wife. Why would you do such a thing? interestingly, in this story, Bathsheba, the character of Bathsheba, is played by a sheep. And you hear that and you think, well, that's a little insulting that you're equating the only woman in the story to a sheep, but that's not quite the point. The point is that the sheep did nothing wrong. The sheep was just existing. The sheep is a totally neutral character that had no agency, that had no ability to affect the story. The sheep couldn't stop the rich man from stealing it from its owner. In the same way, Bathsheba couldn't stop the king from stealing her from her husband. And you think, whoa, 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 whoa. She's a human being. She can make her own decisions, right? Well, put yourself in her shoes. She lived in a culture where women had next to no rights. And the king of the nation comes to her and says that he wants to sleep with her. On top of all of this, when this occurs, her husband is away at war. If she says no, what might happen? The king might have her husband killed, which ends up happening anyway. She might be thrown in prison. There's a lot of people that believe she was related to a very high-ranking official in the court, her grandfather. Her grandfather might lose his job. If any of her parents are still alive, they might be driven out of the city. She might even be killed herself. You can't say no to a king in a culture like this. So when David approaches her, even though she should know what's happening is wrong, she can't say no because her and her family could be very seriously hurt if she refuses them. The biggest issue with this theory, just as far as factuality goes, is the Bible doesn't seem to think that Bathsheba did anything wrong. And that leaves us with one simple conclusion, that David, an individual with a lot of power over Bathsheba, kind of used his power either intentionally or unintentionally to manipulate Bathsheba into having sex with him. And here's why I really want to discuss this today, because I think it's very pertinent to some recent movements in our society. Now, right now, we're kind of distracted by coronavirus. There's a lot of racial unrest going on, social justice protests. But if you reach back just a couple years, you'll remember the springing of another social movement about protecting sexual assault victims called the Me Too movement. And the Me Too movement made a pretty interesting point about certain individuals that would come forward years after the event happened and would say that they were sexually assaulted. Because you see, a lot of mainstream society would see these people and say, well, why didn't you report it when it happened? And often one of the replies is, the person who sexually assaulted me had power over me. They were a government official. They were a potential employer. They were a religious or a civic leader. And because they had power, I was scared. That's a story that we heard a lot from the Me Too movement. And Bathsheba might have gone through a very similar thing. You see, there was a king, there was a political and civic and religious leader, because this king would fulfill all those roles, who had a lot of power over her and her family. So if she told him no, or if she reported him later on, some bad things could happen to her. So she had no choice but to go along with it. Now, I'm not saying that David had intended to use his power to manipulate. We just don't know. This is just the reality of what Bathsheba would have been thinking, what she could have experienced when all this happened. And I want to bring up this theory that Kenneth Bailey and others have pushed, and I kind of want to debunk it, because I think it's a classic case of shifting the blame. You see, David's a hero. He's a hero in the Old Testament. He's still a hero in our churches today because he does so many amazing things. But he has two really big black spots on his record. One is a census that happens later on. You can read that story and research it on your own. But the bigger one, probably, or the one that he's best remembered for, is this story with Bathsheba. And whenever any hero goes down, we're tempted to make excuses for them. And that's the same thing that's happening here. We're trying to excuse David's bad behavior by blaming his victim. And that's just not something that we can do as Christians. Nona Jones, a Christian leader and author, recently tweeted out something I thought was interesting. It said, pride is saying, I've never experienced that, so you're lying. Grace is saying that I've never experienced that and I'm sorry that you did. And I think that sometimes because many of us haven't experienced what Bathsheba went through, then we're tempted to say, well, her point of view isn't relevant. She clearly did something wrong. We're being a little prideful, thinking since we haven't experienced it, well, she must be in the wrong. Brian Loritz said something that's, I think, even more applicable in his book, Insider Outsider. He says, and I quote, "To women who have been victimized by the male power structures, Jesus responds by saying, #MeToo." I think that's really interesting because Jesus himself was victimized by men in power, and Bathsheba probably was too. I just wanted to add these kind of details, kind of recolor the way that we picture this story, because Bathsheba, in all likelihood, was probably a victim here. And we need to remember that when we read this story. David did many great things for Israel and many great things for God, but this was possibly the lowest moment in his entire life, possibly the biggest mess up that he ever did. And we can't remember it any other way. In the same way, we have to remember we can't shift the blame. We can't victim blame when someone that we see as a hero in the church or outside of the church does something wrong. We just have to admit, look, what they did was deplorable. It was horrible. It was inexcusable. And we have to stand beside victims like Bathsheba and say, we're with you, and we're sorry that you experienced what you did. Now, if this was a helpful video for you guys, then please subscribe to us, like this video, share it with your friends, and check out our sermons and our other devotionals while you're at it. Hopefully, some of that stuff can help you grow closer to Jesus and learn to love others just a little bit better today. We're rooting for you. We love you, and we hope that we can see you at the service here in Murfreesboro at 9 a.m. or 10:30 every single Sunday until coronavirus is over with and we can hopefully go back to one service. I'll see you guys later. Bye.